as we all know. So we don't have a live audience, but you can't keep a gnome down. So we are coming to you through the magic of video. And we are keeping safe. We are wearing our designer masks. And we are keeping a social distance, except from the people that we live in the same house. But we are so glad you're here. And even though you're out there somewhere, if you listen very, very carefully, I think you will hear them. Can you hear them? Here they come.
Observation, we feel the time has come to put our experiences and findings on stage. Having received permission, of course, from this authorized Council of Gnomes, which, by the way, took all of 5 years to make its decision. Well, it is our belief that this book fills a deplorable gap, for the published literature on gnomes is virtually non-existent.
One of the chief sources of information has been Wilhelm J. van Dorlich's bulky treatise, De Hominibus Parvisibus, concerning the weak people, published in 1580. Well, it contains a number of striking details. But alas, it uses gnomes with dwarves and other dubious fairy tale creatures so often that its overall reliability is negligible. Today, gnomes are nearly forgotten beings.
Since they work by night and often in human dwellings, it is not sheer coincidence that the word gnome itself is derived from Cugno-Waldo.
Which means come miserable village.
In the ancient dramatic language.
These home administrators would often live in the rafters of barns, or if they were treated well, would look after the livestock, as well as the crops.
Another variant of their name translates as to put in order or to do odd jobs. Yes.
Or without enablement.
In earlier times, the gnome was an accepted member of society in Siberia, Russia, and Europe.
Gnomes were seen regularly, and in all stations of life were rewarded, punished, helped, or hindered by them, depending on their own attitude.
The situation became quite normal. But that was a time when the waters were clear and the forests virginal, when roads led peacefully from one settlement to the other, and the heavens were filled only with birds and stars.
Twinkle, twinkle, twinkle.
Since that time, gnomes have been forced to retreat into hidden corners, both above and below the ground, keeping well out of sight. So much so, in fact, that belief in their existence is waning rapidly.
Nevertheless, just as if you do not look carefully, you will fail to see a hare in the meadow or a deer in the forest. So it is with the gnome.
You may not see them, but if they're all right.
Now that we are so concerned with saving what is left of nature's treasures, there is hope that gnomes will again move about more freely.
performance to all of you and hope that you find much pleasures in these encounters. I'm Gnome 10.
I'm Gnome Tatum. I'm Gnome Becca. I'm Gnome Layla. I'm Gnome Carrie.
And I'm Gnome Jan.
I'm Gnome Hallie. I'm Gnome Ann.
I'm not Teddy.
And he's Gnome Tom.
She's no Jan.
And there's
Nobody around. Legends of the Gnomes.
And now, for the 44th time, the poor woodsman. In a small house, in the middle of a dark and sprawling forest, lived a poor woodsman. He had a wife and many, many, many children, and a black cat with one eye who kept the rats and mice at bay. The children had to walk 2 hours to get to school. Beside the little house was a vegetable garden and even a little flower garden. In the barn were 2 skinny goats and a pig. But the family could hardly manage on the meager earnings of a woodsman, even though the father left the house long before dawn and arrived home exhausted long after sunset. Though they had plenty of firewood and a clear stream nearby, the wife often sighed to her husband,
I don't know how we can possibly bring up all of our children.
and the woodsman would shrug his shoulders and say,
I can't work any harder than I already do.
and this was true. One day, as he was arriving home in the twilight, he saw in the distance the cat leaving the woods with a rat in its mouth. But something was strange. This rat had no tail. Filled with curiosity, the woodsman approached the cat, who was sitting under a bush. She hissed malevolently as he came closer, but the woodsman wasn't afraid. He grabbed the cat by the base of her tail with one hand, and with the other he pressed against her jaws until she opened her mouth and let the thing fall.
Well, I'll be.
Said the woodsman, because what he had picked up was not a rat, but a gnome woman. She was dead. Now the woodsman had seen a gnome once, but not a female one. He took her inside and wiped away a few drops of blood on her cheeks and legs. His wife and children stroked the doll-like little creature and laid her on the window seat in the living room while they ate their meal of potatoes and bacon fat in the kitchen. When they came back, the little gnome woman was gone.
Gone? Perhaps that cat has got her again.
The wife said, but the cat sat sulking under a bush outside, showing one angry eye. The family gave up. They gave up searching and went to bed, as everyone had to be up early the next morning. The woodsman woke up in the middle of the night. Something was tugging gently at his ear. Beside his head stood a gnome.
You saved my life. What can I do to reward you?
She was already dead, wasn't she?
No. See, she was only pretending to be dead, but luckily she is still full of life. Sure, I mean, a scratch here and a black and blue mark there, but she's quite fine. Now tell me, what can I give you as a reward? Here. Simply blow on this flute and ask me to return.
And just like that, he disappeared. Now the woodsman and his wife discussed the matter the rest of the night. They finally decided to ask if they might have 3 wishes, just as in the fairy tales. The following evening, the woodsman blew on his flute. Shortly thereafter, the gnome appeared.
I'd like to hear the 3 wishes.
Said the woodsman, while his wife poked timidly at the fire behind him. The gnome looked a little glum, but finally said,
All right, you may have it. What is your first wish?
I want a nugget of gold so I won't have money worries anymore.
the gnome shook his head.
You may have it, but gold seldom brings happiness.
I don't care.
And your other 2 wishes?
We haven't decided yet.
Simply blow on the flute when you want me again.
Said the gnome with a sigh. The next morning, there on the steps of the little house lay a gold nugget as big as an orange, sparkling in the sun. The woodsman grabbed it up and yelled,
We're rich!
We're rich!
and then he carried the nugget to the village to exchange it for money. But no one in the village had ever seen the gold nugget, and they had no idea what it was worth. The blacksmith advised the woodsman to take it to a jeweler in the city.
Take it to the city.
So the woodsman set off at once. But instead of going the long way, he took a shortcut through the swamps that he remembered from the days of his youth. As he danced along the way, admiring his gold nugget, he slipped off of the path and plunged into a quagmire and immediately began to sink. He tried to reach out for firm ground, but he couldn't make it. In one hand, he clutched the gold nugget, and with the other, he struggled to get the flute out of his pocket so that he could signal the gnome. He was barely able to reach it and blow a shrill blast. He had sunk up to his neck in mud when the gnome appeared.
Get me out of here!
Yeah, that's your second wish, then.
Said the gnome. He stuck 2 fingers in his mouth and whistled shrilly. And in a few minutes, he was surrounded by several other gnomes. Using their little axes, the gnomes chopped down the tree so that it fell across the quagmire, right next to the woodsman. He was barely able to hoist himself up onto it and get back to the path from which he had fallen. When he looked around, the gnomes had disappeared. But still he had the gold nugget in his hand. He went on his way muddy and shivering. Eventually his clothes dried and his courage returned. He finally found a jeweler in the city and entered her shop. The jeweler was a distinguished-looking person in a white smock. She wore gold-rimmed glasses, frowning at the enormous nugget of gold. The jeweler weighed the nugget. Then she asked the woodsman to wait a few minutes, and she scurried out of her shop through the back door to notify the police. A half hour later, the woodsman found himself in the police station.
Where exactly did that come from?
Said a police sergeant in a motherly fashion. The commissioner of police asked the same question about an hour later, but in a less motherly fashion.
How was gonna go? I didn't steal it. I got it from a gnome. I'm just a good guy. Of course, from a gnome.
Said the commissioner, who had never seen a gnome, and never would because he was such an unpleasant person.
By the time it goes, this is the birthday. He ain't got no gnome. Lock him up.
During the days that followed, the woodsman was questioned again and again and threatened with dire consequences
What's dire consequences?
if he did not reveal the source of the gold.
If he didn't see the source of the gold.
Finally, he was examined by a doctor.
No.
But even she could cast no light on the matter, except to report that the woodsman kept babbling about gnomes.
No. No. No.
Now, none of these people had ever seen a gnome because they all had ugly souls. Meanwhile, the gold nugget was kept in a vault in the city council. After a week went by, the poor woodsman became so miserable that one night he blew the flute. After 2 long hours,
Can we make it 3?
after 3 long hours, the gnome appeared.
My wife and children are starving. I want to get out.
Fair enough, that is the third wish. But I have already taken care of your wife and children.
The gnome went that same night to consult.
Okay, set for Costa. Make sure you've got your props.
Northern Siberia is covered by a sparse forest, half the size of Europe, called the There are also mountain chains, discovered only in 1926, in which perfectly preserved frozen mammoths have been found. In winter, there are 3 hours of daylight, and the temperatures hover at 55 degrees below zero. Amid these bleak conditions, the northern lights offer a show of dumbfounding beauty. Fur-bearing animals inhabit the area.
Fox.
Small gray squirrel.
Lynx.
Mince dog.
Martin.
Wolves.
Reindeer.
Large-limbed, hardy gnomes with piercing eyes also live in the Taiga. Unlike woodland gnomes, they are not invariably friendly and can be vicious if crossed. These gnomes often tease the trappers, who, owing to the nature of their work, spend long weeks tracking through the icy taiga. The gnomes spoil animal tracks, cause avalanches, remove trailblazing marks, and imitate wild animal calls in the night, and warn animals of the hunter's approach.
Watch out, guys. The hunters are coming.
North of the waterfront, there lived a gnome named Kostya. He was much more mischievous than the rest. He was a giant of a fellow, more than half again as large as a woodland gnome, even measured in his socks. And he made everyone in the back part of the forest tremble with fright. If he discovered hunters in his territory, he went to them and demanded they pay a toll. And then he pay a toll. The best pelts they had.
The best pelts you have.
If they hesitated, he threatened to make their reindeer ill.
Make you ill.
Or cause them to fall off a cliff.
Don't call them off a cliff.
Knowing full well that the hunter depends on the reindeer for his livelihood.
But I depend on the reindeer for my livelihood.
I know that.
Eventually, all of this came to the attention of the gnome queen of Siberia. A stream of complaints had reached the court. Gnomes were getting a bad name, and the queen decided it was time to teach that scoundrel a lesson. So, she summoned a pair of wise old gnomes. They conferred for a day and a night, and finally they hatched a plan. Then, the younger and more clever of the two was sent off to do the job.
First, the clever gnome went to the wild ponies and spoke to the leading stallion. An hour later, a dozen swift ponies swarmed toward the south and formed a giant half circle. They would act as a lookout. As soon as one of them saw a hunter entering the territory of the malicious gnome, he was to alert the stallion. Meanwhile, the gnome galloped off to the roosting place of a friendly owl. He returned to the half circle of ponies, the owl flying alongside.
Now, after a 2-day wait, the ponies signaled that a hunter riding a reindeer was headed in a northerly direction. The ponies were thanked and sent home, and the stallion, the owl, and the gnome followed the hunter's tracks in the snow. They waited until he had set up his tent for the night. Then the gnome appeared and spoke to him. The man said he would be happy to cooperate with them in punishing the wicked gnome, as he had heard many unpleasant stories about him. Leaving the hunter with his directions, the stallion returned the gnome to the court.
Next evening, as the hunter once more set his tent up for the night, Kostya appeared and demanded a poke.
And then you're pelt.
Why, of course. Take this one, a mink of excellent quality.
The gnome growled suspiciously, but took the fur and disappeared with it into the forest.
2 days later, at twilight, he accidentally passed the same place and was very much surprised to see a most beautiful fox pelt hanging on a branch just over the spot where the tent had stood. The gnome remained at a distance and continued to stare silently at the pelt for a full half hour. He then circled around it 3 times, peering at it suspiciously, but finally decided it was all right. The hunter must have forgotten it. A windfall.
In his greed, Kostya did not see the owl pressed tightly against the trunk of a spruce tree a short distance away, and he began to climb the tree to retrieve the fox pelt. It had a smooth trunk with a few branches, and the gnome had to use his hands and his feet in order to get a firm grip. When the gnome was halfway up, the owl suddenly swooped down and snatched the cap right from his head. The gnome ranted and raved so much that he lost his grip and fell to the ground with a thud.
Too late. The owl with the cap in his claws was flying high above the palace.
The icy night, far from agreeable to the bareheaded gnome. The only thing he could do was pull the collar of his jacket over his freezing head and hurry home. He was so angry that he stayed indoors for a week, giving his poor wife a horrible time.
You're giving me a horrible time.
I don't want to do talking to you.
Oh, one thing after another.
Now, he could have made a new cap by making felt from some of his furs in the house. But a cap is an irreplaceable possession for a gnome. He wanted his own back, no matter what the consequences.
Now, although this gnome was wicked, he was far from stupid. He knew there was more to this matter than met the eye. Nevertheless, it took 10 days for him to summon up enough courage to cover his head with 2 of his wife's kerchiefs and present himself to the queen. He had lost weight, and he felt humiliated. Humiliated.
At court, he was coolly received and had to wait 3 hours before the queen and her council granted him an audience. The queen sat on a dais. She was smaller than the gnome, but she radiated an air of absolute authority. There at the queen's feet lay the cap.
I hope you have learned your lesson, Kostya. None of us are angels, but your behavior has left much to be desired. You may have your cat back if you give away all your furs to the first hunter you see. Do you understand?
Mumbled that guilty gnome. The queen placed a foot under the cap and flipped it into his arm, saying,
Don't put it on him here. You may go.
The giant gnome felt very small. He turned around, went out the door, left the palace, and did what he had promised.
For gnomes,
Gnomes,
be they
good or bad, always keep their word.
It was the end of January A severe northeasterly wind was blowing and the thermometer registered 30 degrees below zero. Everything in the fields and the woods was frozen stiff, and the gnomes' outdoor activities were reduced to a minimum, unless, of course, someone was in need of help.
In the cozy, safe houses under the trees, no games were played and stories were told. Ed Rogerson thought of something new every night. His great-grandfather had known Warche, the magic goldsmith who dared to do everything, and had told stories about him to his son, who told them to his son, who told them to Imp.
One night, Imp's twin daughters, tired and sleepy-eyed from playing, sat underneath their father's feet and begged for a new story about Warche.
Well, have I told you how Warche got back the gold and precious stones a dragon had stolen and returned them to the elves of Taja?
Yes.
Well, how about when to save the life of a little human girl who lay dying, he plucked a life-giving herb from an island in Siberia that was guarded by a ferocious dinosaur?
Yes.
Ha! And how, during a storm, he slipped off the back of an osprey and fell into the middle of the bewitched lake of Warnos and was brought to shore by a blind carp?
Yes.
How about when he was captured by the trolls?
No.
Obviously, okay then. Warche was always falling out with trolls, as he was far too clever. They couldn't stand him. You remember that Warche had 3 houses, right? One in Poland, one in the Ardennes, and one in Norway, so that he could carry out his many tasks. Now, in Norway, he always had troubles with jealous trolls. Now, Warche rode a large fox who ran more swiftly than the wind. He could travel from one house to another, even with his wife and goldsmithing tools aboard, in less than one night. Once, when Warche was in Norway, the trolls dug a hole alongside a path he normally used, and they crushed a number of mice with their filthy fingers and smeared them on the side of the troll hole. Warche and his fox passed that way a few nights later. They had been on a long and tiring journey, and were both extremely hungry. As they neared the trap, the fox smelled the strong odor of mouse and dashed into the hole. Before Warche and the fox could realize it, they were trapped. Warche must have been very tired to have been tricked in such a fashion, but he could do nothing. The trolls led them through an underground passage into their cave and shut Warche behind bars and a side outlet. The fox was put in chains.
Now you will forge gold for us.
We'll never set you free.
And every day they pushed a nugget of gold through the bars and they ordered,
Make a ring.
A bracelet, a necklace,
And you won't get a mouthful of food until you're finished.
and they threw an old bone to the fox. That is, if he was lucky enough not to get a well-placed kick instead. Warche had to follow their orders because he had found no way to escape, and he had to think of the plight of the poor fox as well. Now the trolls wore the bracelets, rings, and necklaces on their misshapen arms, necks, and sausage-like fingers. They danced and danced in their filthy cave until the sweat ran off their bodies and the place stunk worse than usual. When, after 2 weeks, Warche had not returned, his wife Lisa began to worry. Warche had often stayed away in the past, but never as long as this. One night, she went out to look for him, which was very brave of her. She asked all the animals she met if they had heard anything of her husband.
Has anyone seen Warchain? Has anyone seen my husband? Little guy? Whitey red hat? Have you seen Warchain?
But none of them had. At last, at the foot of the mountain, Lisa ran into a rat who had fled the cave where the trolls were keeping Warchain captive because the stench was too much, even for her.
Oh, you're never gonna get him out. They'll only capture you as well. Well, now I can tell you that they keep the key in the third crack in the wall of the side alcove beside the fireplace. And there is only one bolt to the door, but it's too high to your reach. You'll never do it. You'll never do it.
That evening, Lisa made a plan. She gathered together some pans, rotten eggs, beans, asafoetida. Oh, asafoetida. It's devil stuff. It's a gum-like resin that trolls adore, but can never get enough of because the plant that produces it grows in far-away Persia. They love it because of its horrible smell. Now, Lisa disguised herself as a sorceress with a tall pointed cap covering her own and a black robe. She set up a wood fire on a flat rock not far from the troll cave and began to cook her brew. Before long, the revolting smell wafted into the troll cave, and the trolls got up and followed their noses, waddling curiously outside.
What's going on here?
And
Nothing.
asked suspiciously, a bit afraid of the little sorceress.
Nothing exceptional, fine sirs. I'm just a simple, poor sorceress making my simple evening meal.
Smells
good. Would you like to taste some?
Yes.
But only a mouthful, as this is all I have.
The trolls tasted a mouthful and declared that they had never tasted anything so delicious.
Oh, delicious. I see you like this simple food. It just happens that I will be back again tomorrow. Do come. Bring your entire family. Now, how many can I count on?
75.
26.
A means between those three numbers, the trolls said, a little more dim-witted than usual, because they could think of nothing but the heavenly taste on their tongues.
Good. Come just before sunset. I will not be here, as I have business in the neighborhood.
The next evening, the trolls found 5 portions of eggs, beans, and devil's dung, and a huge pan with enough in it for the next 3 days. While the trolls were stuffing themselves, the little woman traveled to their cave and climbed atop their chimney and lowered herself quickly inside. The lazy trolls had actually let their fire go. Lisa ran to the third crack in the wall, grabbed the key, and set Warchain free. Now, he had to quickly unchain the fox, and standing on the fox's back, he lifted the bolt to the outside door. They left in a hurry, but the fox was stiff after being cooped up for so long, and weak from hunger, so they couldn't maintain a fast pace. Fortunately, the trolls were so greedy that after eating all 5 portions, they gobbled up all the extra food as well. When the trolls reached home, belching loudly, they saw what had happened, and they cursed Warchain loudly.
Curse Warchain loudly!
But their bellies were so stuffed that they couldn't move an inch. They simply slumped to the floor and fell asleep. And now, to bed with you both.
The gnome girls were soon fast asleep in their cozy alcove bed. Mother later discovered that they had smuggled a field mouse in with them, and she put him back in his basket.
The heavy oak roots surrounding the house shook softly as the strong icy wind blew above the branches. But below, the sturdy gnome dwelling was warm and safe, at least from the gnomes.
Sleep tight, Mama. Sleep tight, Papa.
Sleetsvice is how gnomes say good night. Now I think it's time for some much needed gnome folk dancing.
The coldest place in all the world is far north of everywhere, and is simply called the North Pole. It is so cold that nothing much lives there, except for one small creature, a lonely gnome.
Now let me tell you, that gnome was cold. In fact, she was so cold living in the North Pole that her ears were a frosty pink and her nose was a bright, bright blue.
She would scream, ah, shout, ah, and stop, just trying to get warm, for you see, the gnome was cold from the inside out.
If I shout,
She shouted,
the cold will get out and not stay in.
Sure enough, every time she would shout or scream, the whole white cold would come out. One day, that gnome could not stand it no longer. Decided that herself would just have me warm. Oh, sweet, that's
She gathered together all of her favorite belongings, her icicle toothbrush, her favorite purple pajamas with the furry feet, and the magic paint set given to her by the master of the northern lights. She packed them all in her knapsack and headed south.
she walked, shouted, skittered, and skated for days until she came to what today is called Alaska. Much to her dismay, she was just as cold there as she had been at the North Pole.
Darn!
She screamed,
I'm so tired and I'm still cold. Then the gnome spotted all the branches and sticks lying around branches and sticks. Maybe, she thought loudly, I could light a fire to stay warm. So she set about collecting wood and building the biggest bonfire you have ever seen. The gnome stood away from the fire and waited to get warm. But nothing happened. So she stood a little closer and still nothing happened.
Then she did something you were never supposed to do and stood so close to that fire that her hair began to smolder.
Oh no! She shouted and jumped head first into a snowbank and put out her smoldering hand.
They don't do like this. She just sat on the porch wall and cried frozen killed.
Oh dear, there must be no way in the world for me to get warm from the inside out.
As she sat there crying, a sea otter happened by, shivering and shaking and wearing a heavy plaid
arriving?
shivered the otter.
Because I'm so cold.
Shouted the gnome.
Then why are you shouting?
Chattered the otter.
Because
Yelled the gnome.
when I shout, it gets part of the cold from the inside out.
Then in full silence,
The otter thought for a moment, then tilted his head back and shouted just as loud as he could. Sure enough, a puff of cold came out.
then in full silence, the two of them just sat there on the log, shivering, shaking, and shouting, and trying to figure out how to get warm from the inside out.
You know,
Yelled the otter.
in all my travels, I found that the humans are seldom cold from the inside out. Maybe if we go to them, they will tell us their secrets.
We have to get them to come to us.
Chattered the gnome.
But I'm so cold, I don't think I could walk another step. They sat and thought, and thought, and thought, and finally,
Okay, take your time. They're done, Chuck. They're done, Chuck.
and finally,
You
Eureka!
didn't have to be rude about it.
All humans like gold, she shouted. I could use my magic paint can given to me by the master of the northern lights
So who?
and turn everything into gold. And then when the humans come, we could ask them for the secret in exchange for the gold.
The gnome rummaged around in her knapsack until she found her magic can of gold paint. Then she and the otter began painting everything gold.
When they were done, they stood back and looked at what they had painted.
With all this gold lying around, the humans are sure to tell us their secret.
Chattered the gnome.
So she and the otter set out to tell humans. The two of them were the highest gnomes around. While the otter looked on, the gnome shouted,
Gold!
Come on now.
That was weak.
Yeah.
Gold!
You got one.
Yeah.
We've discovered gold!
That's good.
I don't know if you've ever heard a gnome shout, but if you have, you'll know what I mean when I say that her voice traveled for miles and miles. There wasn't a human within 1,000 miles that didn't know that there was gold in Alaska.
The gnome and the otter ran down to the edge of the valley to wait for the secret that would make them warm from the inside out. Won't somebody please tell us the secret of how to stay warm from the inside out?
What she said.
The humans began to arrive by the hundreds, but they simply ignored the gnome and the otter. Won't someone please tell us the secret?
Come on, someone.
But no one would stop. Instead, they pushed that poor gnome and that otter into a snowbank. Those humans were so busy picking up all that gold, no one noticed the gnome and the otter.
just about then, a prospector happened by and saw the two sitting in snow.
The prospector thought for a moment and then said,
Who are you?
Asked the prospector.
Why are you about gold?
Well, I'm the gnome and
I'm the otter guy.
Shivered the gnome.
We don't need the gold. We put it here so that you guys would come to tell us the secret of how to stay warm from the inside out. But everyone's just ignoring us. All the humans murmured.
The prospector thought for a moment, and then said, "Thank you,
I'll be back.
Then he hurried off to talk to the other prospectors.
We're getting wet, aren't we?
Yeah.
Nobody will be arrested because he's too short of the filter. We have come up to the solution to the problem.
All the humans murmured and mumbled, fretted, and fumed until they finally figured out what to do. With cheers
And strokes.
they all marched back to the gnome and the otter.
The gnome and the otter could not believe their good fortune and listened very carefully.
We have unanimously decided
To tell
to
you the
tell you the
secret.
secret of how to keep warm from the inside out.
The reason that humans are getting warm without is rotten surface, that's the secret.
Well, that's great, Noble. But where do we find this beloved friendship?
Asked the otter through chattering teeth.
The prospector thought for a moment, then continued.
Friendship is being friends with someone. And since you're in Alaska, you and the gnome are already in that state.
The gnome and the otter looked at one another and realized that the prospector was right. They began to warm from the inside out. Then the gnome asked, "But what about love? Where do we find that?"
You know, it's not what it's for. When this goes, and you're husband and love, we will heal and everything, natural calm in your eyes.
With that, two miners got on his side. Then,
Gnome Alaska.
Population 2.
The gnome and the otter were so near. They didn't even mind that the prospectors misspelled gnome. It's working. I'm beginning to feel warm and toasty inside.
And who'd have thought that the secret was right here, under our nose, and in our hearts?
And so the gnome from Nome and her good friend, the otter, went back to the North Pole.
They lived there till this very day,
Wrapped up warmly in love and friendship,
sipping tea.
and talking very softly.
So when you're cold from the inside out, and you don't know what to do,
Remember love and friendship, and warmth will come to you.
nights of true good for man and nature, so can you. Be kind and nice to all you meet, and give the birds a special treat.
Our stories told of time and song to bid farewell and journey on. A special wish from each of us to each one here at festival. May happy days of holidays be celebrated.
Be with you.
In it.
A gnome in time.
Norman Tone. A gnome betwinkles the midnight moon.
The gnomes preserve sweet nature's lore.
And gifts us with the wisdom of yours.
Would that humankind could learn from the gnome.
To protect all creatures without and within.
To nurture all nature.
In root and branch.
To reveal a beauty abounding.
Would that I would be known.
In time and in tune.